When you think of bees, you probably picture the good guys of the insect world. But what if I told you that some bees have a much darker craving? Because in the deep, humid jungles of South America, there's a group of bees that has completely forsaken the vegetarian lifestyle and is looking for decomposing, rotting animal flesh. Processed, fermented, and stored the same way regular bees make the honey you drizzle on your morning toast. Welcome to the bizarre, slightly nauseating world of vulture bees and their infamous meat honey. So first, let's just establish something. Bees are incredible. Like, genuinely, one of the most important living creatures on the planet. They pollinate roughly a third of the entire global food supply, and their contribution to agriculture is worth somewhere in the region of $160 billion every single year. Without bees, the cascading collapse of our food systems would be catastrophic. So yeah, bees are kind of a big deal. And on top of all that, people actually like them, which honestly is remarkable when you think about it. Because bees can sting you, and yet, unlike wasps, which I think we can all agree have serious PR problems, bees have managed to cultivate this warm and cuddly reputation. Probably has something to do with Winnie the Pooh and that animated movie. But here's the thing, bee isn't just one animal. It's not one species, one genus, not even one family. The word bee actually refers to any of the thousands of winged species belonging to the clade known as Anthophila. And in total, that's over 20,000 known species. And while the vast majority of them are perfectly pleasant little pollinators living their best flower-to-flower life, a small handful of them, well, they took one look at that lifestyle and said, hard pass. And out of those outliers, there is one group in particular that stands in a category entirely of its own. A group so strange, so contrary to everything the word bee stands for, that when researchers first truly understood what they were looking at, it reportedly took a while for it to actually sink in. Meet the vulture bees. Now, before you picture some massive, terrifying, hornet-like beast, let me stop you right there. These guys are actually quite small, somewhere between 8 and 22 millimeters in length, small, brown, and completely stingless. No stinger, none at all, which, given what they're capable of, feels almost unfair. Vulture bees are actually a collective nickname for three very closely related species, all belonging to the genus Trigona. The specific species are Trigona crassipes, Trigona necrophaga, and yes, you can take a guess at what necro in that name might hint at, and Trigona hypogea. You'll find them in remote stretches of rainforests and jungles in Central and South America, deep in the kind of humid, dense undergrowth where the sun barely touches the floor. And while they share their habitat with thousands of other Trigona bee species that are living perfectly normal, pollen-collecting lives, these three decided at some point in evolutionary history to go a completely different direction, like a completely, wildly, aggressively different direction. The rest of the Trigona family forages across more than 500 plant species, collecting nectar and pollen just like you'd expect. Standard bee behavior. Good students of the bee curriculum. But Trigona crassipes, necrophaga, and hypogea, they have zero interest in your flowers. They don't want your nectar and pollen. What they want, what they have evolved specifically to seek out and consume, is rotting flesh. And we're not even talking about fresh meat. That would almost be too straightforward. No, these bees prefer their protein decomposing. The older, the more decayed, the better. A fresh steak is going to get a hard pass from a vulture bee. But a rotting carcass? An animal that's been baking in the tropical heat for a few days? Now that's what they call a meal. Here's the wild part though. Scientists actually knew about these bees for hundreds of years before they truly understood what they were eating. It wasn't until the 1980s that researchers, observing colonies in the wild, confirmed that these bees were actively foraging for rotting meat rather than plant material. Meaning, for centuries, vulture bees were hiding in plain sight, and nobody clocked what they were actually doing. Which honestly feels like nature pulling off the longest con in history. Now let's talk about how they actually eat, because this is where things really start to get interesting. And by interesting, I mean slightly nauseating. When a forager vulture bee lands on a carcass, it doesn't just take a nibble. These bees have evolved unusually sharp, strong mandibles. Their jaw structures, made from a compound called chitin, which is essentially a chain of sugars and proteins. While all bees technically have mandibles, the vulture bee's version is comparatively more robust and precise, built for something that normal bee mandibles were never designed to handle: cutting, scraping, and tearing through decomposing flesh. One of their most noted methods of access? They'll tunnel directly through the softer tissue of a carcass, often through the eye sockets, to get inside and access the decomposing meat more efficiently, which is one of those sentences that I genuinely cannot believe I'm saying about a bee. But here we are, but it doesn't stop there. Much like flies, vulture bees actually vomit specialized digestive enzymes directly onto the rotting flesh. These enzymes begin to break down and liquefy the tissue, essentially pre-digesting it into something the bee can then drink up. It's basically nature's most horrifying soup preparation method. They're doing to a carcass what a blender does to fruit, just with more existential dread involved. And once the forager has processed and consumed a good amount of this meat slurry, it doesn't just digest it on the spot, because that would be selfish. Instead, it stores the partially liquefied meat inside an organ called the crop, a thin-walled section of its digestive tract specifically designed to hold food temporarily without fully breaking it down. Think of it as a living lunchbox. From there, the bee flies back to the colony, carrying this meat payload home for the rest of the hive. Back at base, this is where the process gets truly remarkable. The forager regurgitates the stored meat into specialized pots within the hive structure, little containers embedded into the colony's architecture. And what happens next is where the honey part of meat honey comes from. Okay, so here's a question for you. What makes normal honey honey? The short version is this: worker bees collect nectar, store it in their bodies in a gland called the hypopharyngeal gland, process it with enzymes, and then regurgitate it into honeycomb cells where it dries and concentrates into the thick golden substance we all know. The magic is in the enzymatic processing inside the bee's body and the specific gland where it all happens. Vulture bees do the exact same thing, same gland, same enzymatic process, same general mechanics, except instead of nectar, the raw material going in is partially digested, rotting meat slurry. And what comes out? That's what researchers have started calling meat honey, or, in more clinical circles, carrion honey. And I want to be very clear here, so this stuff is not honey in any way that you or I would recognize it. The similarities basically begin and end with the production process. Visually, it starts out as a thick, almost paste-like substance. Imagine something closer to lard or tallow than anything in a honey jar. Over time, as it ages inside the hive, it gradually becomes more viscous, more fluid. But it never quite reaches the flow of regular honey. In terms of color, it's typically a translucent white, or sometimes a pale, yellowish tint, completely lacking the warm ambers, golds, and deep browns we associate with real honey. So if someone handed you a jar, you probably wouldn't even think honey. You'd think something had gone very, very wrong. And then there's the taste. Now, to be clear, the number of people who have voluntarily tasted meat honey is not large. This is not a widely reviewed product on any food blog. But from those brave enough to report back, the flavor profile of meat honey has been described as intensely salty, oddly sweet, and deeply, deeply smoky. Like someone combined a salt flat, a smokehouse, and something you absolutely cannot identify, all into one overwhelming taste experience. The few testers on record describe it as not being for the faint-hearted, which I think is doing some serious diplomatic heavy lifting. But here's the thing, to the vulture bee colony, this is the most valuable substance in the world. Meat honey is extraordinarily high in calories. It's protein-dense in a way that regular honey never could be, and it functions as the primary food source for the entire colony, including the larvae. The queen, the workers, the young, everybody is raised on this stuff. It's not a quirk or a side dish. This is the foundation of the whole operation. Now, what's fascinating is that some vulture bee colonies, specifically Trigona hypogea populations, have been observed occasionally adding plant material to their meat-honey batches, things like sweet resins or plant secretions. And when they do this, they also tend to let the mixture ferment and mature for longer than a standard batch. The result, reportedly, is something that skews slightly sweeter and has a more complex flavor profile, which honestly means these bees have independently discovered the concept of recipe development. Nature's most unlikely food scientists, crafting artisanal fermented meat honey in the jungle. I don't know whether to be horrified or impressed. Both, maybe. But let's take a step back and ask the bigger question. Why? Why did these bees go down this road in the first place? Because this isn't just a quirk, this is a fundamental evolutionary departure from the entire bee lineage. And researchers have been working to understand how and why it happened. One of the most compelling theories comes from studying the environments where vulture bees live. Research into their habitat found that the specific forested regions they occupy tend to have remarkably low availability of protein-rich plant materials. Most bees get their protein primarily from pollen, but in these dense, specific rainforest zones, pollen-rich flowers are surprisingly sparse relative to the competition for them. And so, the theory goes, over many, many generations, the ancestors of today's vulture bees were essentially pushed by their environment into finding an alternative protein source, and the rainforest floor, rich with the remains of dead animals, offered one that few other bees were tapping into. That's the environmental pressure theory. But there's a second, more microbiological explanation that's even more interesting, and it comes from a landmark study published in 2021 by researchers at the University of California, Riverside. Led by entomologist Quinn McFrederick, the team managed to do something that had never been done before. They comprehensively mapped the gut microbiome of vulture bees and compared it to both standard Trigona bees and to other carrion-eating animals. And what they found was genuinely stunning. The gut bacteria of vulture bees look almost nothing like those of regular bees. Instead, they bear a striking resemblance to the gut microbiomes of actual vultures and hyenas, other animals famous for their ability to safely process rotting meat. Specifically, the vulture bees showed high concentrations of acid-producing bacteria, including lactobacillus and carnobacterium strains, which generate the kind of intensely acidic gut environment needed to neutralize the pathogens and toxins that swarm through decomposing flesh. In fact, their stomach acid is estimated to be roughly 35% more potent than that of strictly vegetarian bee species. Without that acid, eating a rotting carcass would simply kill the bee. It's the difference between a functional digestive system and a death sentence. And this is where the chicken and egg question gets really interesting. Did these bees develop meat-eating habits first, and then their gut bacteria adapted to support it? Or did they somehow acquire this unusual bacteria first, which then enabled them to begin eating meat, which then drove the rest of the evolutionary changes we see today? It's a genuinely unresolved debate, and the researchers were careful to note that the bacteria-first hypothesis, while fascinating, still needs more evidence. But the idea that your gut microbiome could steer your evolutionary destiny, that the microbes living inside you could reshape what you become over generations, that's one of the most mind-bending ideas in modern biology. And the physical changes don't stop at the gut, because if you're going to completely abandon the pollen lifestyle, you don't need to look like a bee that's still chasing pollen. And so, vulture bees have gradually lost something that most people consider a defining feature of bees: their fuzz. Regular bees are famously fuzzy, and not for aesthetic reasons. Mochi's aoi. That fuzz functions essentially like biological Velcro. It's evolved specifically to catch and hold thousands of pollen grains as the bee moves from flower to flower. It's a pollen delivery system built right into their bodies. But if you're a vulture bee who stopped caring about pollen a long time ago, that fuzz is not just useless. It's actually a liability. Imagine trying to maneuver through a decomposing carcass while covered in thousands of tiny hair-like structures that are just going to catch blood, tissue, and whatever else you'd find in there. Not exactly ideal. And so, over time, vulture bees shed the fuzz. They're noticeably sleeker and smoother than their relatives, almost clean-shaven by comparison. Another quiet but profound physical testament to just how far they've diverged from their cousins. Yes, and here's the part of this story that I think is actually the most remarkable, in a way that kind of puts everything else into perspective. Despite all of this, the unconventional diet, the unusual lifestyle, the remote and pressured habitat, vulture bees are doing absolutely fine. Not a single one of the 3 vulture bee species is classified as endangered. In a world where bee populations globally are under serious threat from habitat destruction, pesticide use, climate disruption, and pollution, the vulture bee is holding its ground. Some colonies have been observed growing to populations of up to 100,000 individuals. For context, that's larger than many standard honeybee colonies. It turns out that when you've carved out a completely unique ecological niche, one with essentially zero competition because no other bee on Earth is doing what you're doing, the world just kind of has to work around you. There's also one more trick in the vulture bee's repertoire that I think deserves a mention, because it really hammers home just how far removed these creatures are from the bees you grew up reading about in picture books. On occasion, vulture bees, and some of their other trigona relatives, have been observed engaging in predatory behavior. Not scavenging, actual predation. Specifically, researchers have documented them preying upon frog eggs, using those sharp, chitin-reinforced mandibles to slice through the outer membrane and consume the contents. Bees eating frog eggs. The boogeyman of the amphibian world turns out to be a bee. A small, stingless, technically honey-producing bee. And here's the thing that I keep coming back to. These bees are technically still making honey. Not the kind anyone's going to spread on toast, obviously, but the biological process, the enzymatic transformation, the glandular processing, the storage in wax pots, it's the same system, which means that honey, as a concept, is not a product of flowers. It's a product of bees. These animals took an ancient biological toolkit that evolved to process sweet nectar and redirected it entirely to process rotting meat. And it worked. That's not an accident. That's one of the most elegant and unsettling examples of evolutionary repurposing in the entire animal kingdom. And somewhere deep in a South American rainforest right now, or inside a hive tucked in a hollow tree or an old termite mound, a colony of up to 100,000 vulture bees is going about its day. Foragers are tunneling through carcasses. Crops are being loaded up with meat slurry. Worker bees are processing the haul through their acid-lined guts. Pale white paste is slowly maturing in tiny wax pots, and the queen is very much thriving. All because, at some point in evolutionary history, 3 species of tiny stingless bees looked at the flower game, looked at the rotting corpse on the jungle floor, and made a choice that was undeniably disgusting, wildly effective, and honestly kind of impressive. Nature is never, ever boring, and I think that's something we can all be grateful for. And if you're sitting there thinking, okay, but how does this even relate to me? I live nowhere near a South American rainforest. Fair point. But here's why I think this story matters beyond just being a great piece of dinner party trivia. And it is incredible dinner party trivia. Use it wisely. The vulture bee challenges something that we unconsciously do all the time, which is assume that nature has a fixed script, that bees do bee things, that flies do fly things, that vultures do vulture things, and everything stays neatly in its lane. But the vulture bee is proof that under the right conditions, the right environmental pressure, the right microbial passengers in the gut, enough time and enough generations, any lineage can veer off in a direction nobody would have predicted. And that process is happening constantly, in millions of species, in every corner of the planet, in ways we haven't even noticed yet. We've known these bees exist for centuries. We only figured out what they were eating in the 1980s, and we only mapped their gut bacteria in detail in 2021. Nature is always one step ahead of us, and every time we think we have a complete picture of how some corner of the animal kingdom works, something like the vulture bee shows up and very politely turns that picture upside down. So yeah, bees are making meat honey. The world is strange and wonderful and occasionally deeply unsettling. and I am completely here for all of it. And look, I'm not going to pretend I want to try meat honey. That's a hard no from me. But I will say that the vulture bee has absolutely earned its place in the Hall of Fame of genuinely extraordinary animals. In a world full of creatures trying to survive, these three little species found a way by going where no bee had gone before. And they've been quietly thriving in the shadows of the rainforest ever since. That's not horrifying. Well, it is a little horrifying, but it's also kind of magnificent. Okay, if you think about it the right way. And now, unfortunately, you know about it. And so does everybody you're going to tell. You're welcome, and I'm sorry.